In Lecture 6, we will be looking at the custody and administration of securities. We will look at the registration, transfer, and custody of securities. Now we're talking about custody, administration of securities, and we're talking about registration and transfers. So these sections are under the Companies Act. So I've just put there in bold so you can see it's a different act. And the Companies Act states that any securities issued by a company need to be evidenced by certificates. If it is uncertified, they need some evidence and title to support those securities. Okay. And then Section 50 of the Companies Act states that every company needs to establish cause. Okay, so with the Registrar of Securities, you need to establish that those shares actually belong to that company, and the people that bought those shares, there needs to be a register of that. So they need to maintain this register in accordance with prescribed standards. Section 34 of the FMA then talks cat walking on computer. Let me start the slide again now that I don't have the cat walking over the computer and meowing into the microphone. Custody and administration of securities. When you talk about the registration and transfer of securities, you need to look at the Companies Act. And the Companies Act says that securities issued need to be evidenced by certificates. If they are uncertificated, the company doesn't need to then issue certificates evidencing this. They just need evidence to purport a title of those securities. Section 51 of the Companies Act says that they need to establish cause and they need a register of issued securities. So they need proof. We have issued these securities to these people, and they need to maintain that register in accordance with prescribed standards. So it needs to be standardized that every company has the issue of securities done in a standardized manner, so it's easy to find ownership of securities. Back to the Financial Markets Act. Section 34 states that the issue of uncertified securities, so very often this is unlisted companies when you deal with uncertified securities, they need to keep a record of the total number and nominal value of each security that they have issued. If a company issued certified securities, it needs to comply with Section 50 of the Companies Act. They need to enter cause to that securities register. So why are we registering this security? Why do we have certificates? And in that cause, they need to say the total number of securities in uncertified form. With regards to certified security, there are 5 different things that they need to put on the certificates: names, addresses, securities, etc., etc. So when talking about uncertified securities, again, we are stating in Section 50 that a record needs to be administered and maintained. And this record forms part of that company's securities register, and it needs to be maintained in a certain manner, which is prescribed by the registrar. When you talk about custody of securities, you're talking about the safekeeping of securities. Who makes sure that securities are kept safe and that these records are kept safe? So the Financial Markets Act makes provision for the safekeeping of securities by Central Securities Depository, the CSD, as well as participants of a CSD. So the CSD itself provides the infrastructure for holding uncertified securities, as well as a settlement system, specifically with dealing with uncertified securities. You want to make sure that your transaction is settled appropriately. So it's good to have a third party that deals with the settlement of these securities to make sure that it is settled in the time and the manner that you are expecting. Okay, and according to Section 1 of the Financial Markets Act, we are dealing with the definitions here. A participant is defined as a person authorized by the CSD to perform custody and administration services. So if you look in South Africa, there are about 9 participants. The banks are participants. They are registered participants, and they deal with custody and administration of securities. Section 27 talks about the licensing for a central securities depository. So it says that it needs to be licensed under Section 29. Very important here, only a juristic person may apply for a central securities depository license. So very much like an exchange, a natural person cannot apply for a license. It needs to be a juristic person, generally a company. So it talks about the application itself. So the application itself needs to be in the prescribed manner. And in section C, it talks about all the documentation accompanying it. So at the moment, we have our CSD, which is straight. They deal with all the settlements and safekeeping and custody of securities in South Africa. Until recently, we only had one exchange as well. You remember the exchange provisions are a lot more in depth than these provisions.